distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, hello and welcome. Welcome to our inaugural Sinology Art of Living seminars. The seminars are put on by the Academy of Sinology at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. We are honoured and delighted to have you join us as we explore various topics in ancient Chinese thought that may provide inspiration and guidance for our world today. Now, there is a total of 3 sessions across today and tomorrow, with 2 taking place today and a further one tomorrow. Now, all 3 sessions are different. Now, just before we start, if I could gently remind everyone to ensure that your camera is turned off and your microphone is muted to prevent disruption during the presentations. All right. So first of all, please join me in welcoming the university's Assistant Director of the Institute of Education and Humanities, Dr. Jeremy Smith. Dr. Smith will provide an opening address for this occasion. Dr. Smith, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to everyone to our Art of Living seminars. It's a very special year this year. The university is celebrating 200 years of being. That makes us the 3rd oldest university in England and Wales. That's a wonderful heritage. That's a wonderful place and an appropriate place for the Academy of Sinology to be in partnership with a higher educational institution. But 200 years is just a drop in the ocean if we compare it to the treasures of ancient Chinese culture, literature, and philosophy. Over many thousands of years, Chinese culture and philosophy has provided us with great insights into the nature of being, into the nature of society, into the nature of family relationships, and importantly, into how humans interact through their daily lives. Ancient Chinese literature provides us with great insight. But if there's one quality that I hope our seminars today will draw out, and I'm sure they will, it is humility. Humility is integral to the smooth functioning of society and personal relationships. And it's at the core of what we do at the Academy of Sinology. At the start, it was mentioned that we are celebrating and memorializing our first provost, Professor Zhou, over 2 days of workshops and a memorial service yesterday. Professor Zhou was typified more than anything by his humility, by his deep, profound academic knowledge, which he wore very lightly. So I'm really pleased that we are able today, on behalf of the university, on behalf of the Academy of Sinology, to celebrate the life of Professor Zhou through workshops that look to bring the ancient Chinese words, philosophies, understandings, knowledge to present day, and show that the past is relevant in the present day context, that the past isn't something dead and gone, but it's actually all around us and provides profound insights into how we should live our lives, how the world should operate. And after all, the world today is a place where we are crying out for insights about better ways of living harmoniously together. So I pass back now at this welcome to either Catherine or Kelly. I wish everyone a very good day I wish everyone takes away from our workshops real profound insights into the art of living. Thank you for being here. Enjoy your day. Kelly, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very thoughtful words, Dr. Smith. Well, this now brings us to the seminars bit of the program. And we have 3 seminars organised for this session. Now, each presentation will be 45 minutes, and there'll be about 10 minutes for questions at the end. Now, I'd first like to invite Dr. Catherine No, who will be presenting 2 seminars, 2 presentations in this session. Now, Catherine graduated from her master's from the Academy in 2018, and she has completed her doctorate in Sinology this year. Her first topic will be how to enjoy learning, lessons from the Analects. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you very much to the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, and also to the Academy of Sinology for this opportunity to participate in such wonderful seminars. I feel truly humbled and honoured to join with everyone in celebrating 200 years of higher education at UWTSD, and also to commemorate the Academy's first provost, Professor Joel. So it's very fitting that the first topic is about learning, and my next talk will be about the application of this learning. Learning is, of course, lifelong, and we do so on the shoulders of giants. So I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for my many professors and teachers who've taught me so much about how to learn and also to really enjoy my learning. So the aim of this talk is very simple. Is to explore how Confucius enjoyed his learning. And my argument is that with Confucian thought, we can enjoy our learning too, whatever we're doing, wherever we are, whether we're at school, university, work, or home. Now, of course, Confucius needs no introduction. American sinologists Henry Rosemont Jr. and Roger Ames write that Confucius is arguably the most influential philosopher in human history. Just to get an idea of how much he influenced various cultures in the East and Southeast for over 2,500 years, philosopher Brian Van Norden asks us to imagine a person with the combined influence of Jesus and Socrates on the Western tradition. And that would be Confucius for the East. To this day in China, Confucius is celebrated not as a philosopher or a religious leader, but as the utmost sage and foremost teacher. Now, the text that I will be using today is the Analects, and it's considered one of the earliest and most authoritative accounts of the life and thought of Confucius. Now, throughout the ages, the Analects has taken different roles. So when Confucianism became the state ideology for China in 134 BCE, it was used as a primer for the princes, but also as a political and philosophical manual. During this time, it was also used as a sacred text for self-cultivation. And then in the last 600 years of Imperial China, the Analects was part of the compulsory core curriculum for the civil service examinations. Most recently, the Analects is also a cultural symbol. So we heard that in 2019, when Chinese President Xi visited France, French President Macron gifted him with an original edition of the very first translation of the Analects into French. It was published in 1688. Now, beyond China, the Analects has also significantly influenced the ideology, ethical system, and education of Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Japan, and Korea. So the Analects really has inspired generations of scholars throughout time and space, and continues to inspire many today, because research on the Analects is very much a very vibrant field. So let's take a look inside. The Analects is actually structured as 20 chapters, or also translated as books. And in these chapters, there's a total of about 500 individual passages, as you can see here with my arrows. And these passages present as standalone quotes of Confucius, sometimes conversations that Confucius has with his students or other contemporaries, could even be observations about Confucius, and even quotes from his students and their conversations. Now, the translation that I will be using today on my slides is that of Burton Watson's, although I will make modifications, and where I haven't used Watson's translation, I will have specified on the slides. Now, when we look through the text of the Analects, there are various themes, and one of the very core themes is that of learning. But more specifically, this idea of enjoying learning, which perhaps comes as a surprise to some people, because people feel that education in the Confucian heritage cultures today seem to be very focused on exams and academic achievement, in some ways related to the tiger parent mentality. But when we return to the source, the origin of Confucian thought, Confucius himself, we see quite the opposite. And this is apparent from the very first passage in the Analects. So let's take a look at that now. So the master being Confucius, said, "Learning and constantly applying this learning, is it not enjoyable? To have friends coming from afar, is it not delightful? Feeling no discomposure when not understood by others, is one not an exemplary person?" So this is actually quite a catchy opening. I mean, who doesn't want to enjoy themselves, win friends and influence people, and not get depressed? You know, when you read this, you get the idea that he's very positive, very carefree. And I can imagine if Confucius was talking in front of me, he'd be smiling. Now, I couldn't find a photo of Confucius smiling. You sort of get the picture here. And you can imagine him saying, "You're learning and practicing. Are you enjoying yourself? You have friends coming from afar. Isn't that wonderful? And even if others don't recognize you, does that really matter to an exemplary person?" So he's really living this. And through the questions, he's inviting us to see things from his perspective. Now, Confucius's love of learning is not simply in the first passage, it's throughout the text. For example, in the 5th chapter, Confucius says that in a village of 10 households, so that's a small hamlet, then certainly might be people who have similar virtues, but no one who can surpass him for his fondness for learning. And then when he heard that one of his students, Zilu, failed to come up with the words to describe him, Confucius offered this self-appraisal. He said, "Why don't you just say, he's a person who's so impassioned that he forgets to eat, who's so joyous that he forgets to be worried, and who grows into old age without noticing time passing by." Throughout the Analects, he also tells us about his great enthusiasm, he's tireless in his learning and teaching. So we really get the idea that he's enjoying it and he's a happy person. But how does he do it? Let's analyze the very first passage. learning and constantly applying this learning, is it not enjoyable? Well, not all of us are full-time students, but we are learning in some form or another throughout our lives. In fact, humans are pre-programmed to learn. According to British psychologist Alan Baddeley, he tells us that many successful species like butterflies, ants, etc., come into the world pre-programmed with the equipment to survive. Humans, however, are a species that can only survive by learning, and without learning, we would have no language, tools, transport, and little in the way of society. So, if we take Confucius seriously, which many generations of scholars, either inside or outside of China have, we should be asking ourselves, what does he have that we don't? If all of us as humans are meant to be learning from the times of Confucius to now, well, why aren't we enjoying ourselves as much as him? I'd like to draw your attention to this passage and how in the first sentence, there's really three elements: learning, application, and constancy. So what kind of learning is Confucius talking about? How does he practice this learning? And then what is the time sort of element? Because if we're unclear about any of these three elements, it's going to be difficult to achieve the outcome, which is enjoyment. So first of all, what kind of learning is this? And more particularly, how does that apply to our lives? Well, let's begin by looking and exploring Confucian thought as it is today, how it's taught today, what we think of it. What do you think of Confucian learning today? What kind of learning is it? Well, it's taught in major universities around the world, often in the Faculty of Humanities, in the Department of East Asian Studies or Chinese Studies, and it's taught as an academic study of a historical Asian tradition. But is this the same as what Confucius was talking about? I'd beg to differ. Confucius talked about his teachings as something for everyone. He was keen to teach people from all walks of life, all ages, and even people beyond the known borders of the Chinese kingdom at the time. So his kind of learning was more than just something historical or simply relegated as Asian. Now, this leads us to another idea about Confucian thought, which is that it's a set of moral doctrines. And Chinese philosopher Pei Mingni argues that this is a gross oversimplification and misinterpretation of Confucian thought. He argues and proposes that Confucianism is a art of living, a way of living. Because if we think about it in terms of moral norms simply stipulate responsibilities as imposed by an external authority that really constrains the individual. Now, what we see in Confucian in the Analects is that Confucius' student and Confucius himself sought political office. They were not sort of moral theorists. And then the third idea is that Confucianism is a religion. But to the excitement of many of the thinkers during the Enlightenment movement in Europe, they realized that Confucius did not talk about a supreme being with absolute moral authority, but he talked about teaching and learning. And finally, sinologists today will often describe Confucian thought as a philosophy, but they almost always begin by defending it as a philosophy because it is very different from the Western analytical philosophy that's taught in universities today. So again, it doesn't really fit the box. So what exactly is Confucian learning? I'd like to use a passage from the Analects, and it's a quote from one of Confucius's prominent students, Zixia. So Zixia said, if someone recognizes and admires worthiness, and therefore changes their lustful nature, they're able to fully exhaust their strength in serving their parents, extend themselves to the utmost in serving their leader, and are trustworthy in speech when acting with friends and associates. Even if you said of such a person they're not learned, I would insist that it is precisely such qualities that make one worthy of being called learned. So Zixia is echoing the thoughts of Confucius. And you can see in this particular quote that his idea of learning is not something academic. It's not regurgitating or reciting texts. There's also no mention of divine spirits, moral rules, or any hint of deductive argumentation. So what is it? According to Harvard professor Du Weiming, Confucian learning is a humanistic education. It provides us with a comprehensive and integrated vision of the human condition. This humanistic education is a lifelong learning to realize our humanity, which is a sensitivity and understanding of ourselves, but also our family, community, the nation, the natural world, and ultimately the universe. And that's because as humans, we don't exist alone. We exist within a network of relationships, our family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, etc. And so Confucian learning supplements and value adds to all forms of learning because it helps us understand how to use our knowledge, whatever we're learning, within the context of humanity at large, so within the context of our relationships. And it makes us enjoy our learning, and because we're able to use our knowledge to create meaning in our relationships, to find purpose in our lives, to be at peace with ourselves, in harmony with others and the natural world. So in short, Confucian learning is the art of living, and it's useful for any profession and at any stage of our lives. Now let me give you an example. Here, Confucius said, although one may have talents as admirable as those of the Duke of Zhou, if he employs them in an arrogant or a mean manner, then whatever other qualities he has are not worth a look. So who was the Duke of Zhou? Well, he was one of the founders of the Zhou dynasty, the longest dynasty in Chinese history, and the dynasty of Confucius's time. Although Confucius was born approximately 500 years after the Duke of Zhou, they never personally met, Confucius revered the Duke for his exemplary leadership, talent, and virtue. And it was this that Confucius ascribed to creating and establishing solid foundations for the longevity of the Zhou ruling state. So today, Confucius is celebrated as the utmost sage, but the Duke of Zhou is honored as the original sage. Now, it's very significant that Confucius invokes his name here, because someone who has the talents of the Duke of Zhou would be almost a sage in the eyes of Confucius. But Confucius warns us that if this person is arrogant or stingy, then that cancels out all their merits. Now, how does this actually help us today? Well, it supplements our learning because regardless of what we're doing, we need to know how to conduct ourselves and relate to others. So if we're at work, we're the best at our work, the most productive in the department, or if we're the top student in our cohort, how do we conduct ourselves? Well, taking this line on board, we have to always realize there are areas of improvement. And if we think about it, even the athlete who sets the world record can still beat their own record. So we can only improve. And then how do we relate to others? Well, we should never look down on anyone just because we think we know more or we're better than them, because everyone has their strengths. And we simply need to be open to learning from the strengths of others to improve ourselves. So if we are able to take this line on board in our lives, then it's very likely that we will have more constructive interpersonal interactions. So you can see from this very simple example that Confucian thought doesn't add to our workload or our busy schedule, but actually it adds value. It makes us understand what we should be valuing. And it's a humanistic education because it helps us realize our humanity, this sensitivity to others, because no one wants to be around an arrogant know-it-all. So if we are able to remain humble, then we can better live in harmony with those around us. And it's also a humanistic education because it's centered on human life and humanity at large. Now, you might say that these passages are quite isolated. They sound like maxims or fortune cookie sayings. Is there some sort of logic or an underlying system by which we can think of all of these different ideas? Well, ancient commentators and modern scholars have noted that there's a particular passage in the 7th chapter which encapsulates Confucian learning. So Confucius says here, aspire to the way, hold on to virtue, be grounded in humanity, and immerse in the arts. So a better way of understanding this passage is to think about it from the metaphor of a tree. So if we think of a tree, the most visible part of the tree is the top, right? The branches, leaves, flowers, and fruits. And that would represent the arts. Now, the arts in the historical context refers to the 6 Confucian arts, like writing and calculation, essentially basic skills that any literate person in ancient China would need to get by. But if we're thinking about it from the modern context, these arts refers to any career, skill, all forms of learning. It would be able to refer to any discipline in a university or any skill provided by a vocational training institution and more. So just like the fruits on the tree that others can enjoy, well, the fruits of our labor are our knowledge and skills that we can offer to others. We can offer to our organization, to our family, to the community. So that's this idea of immerse in the arts. Now, where do these arts, how do they develop? Well, if we think of the metaphor of the tree again, how exactly do these fruits, leaves, branches, how do they flourish? How do they remain healthy? Well, this stems from the trunk and the roots ultimately. So that's the next part, to be grounded in humanity. So the trunk of the tree is also very visible, it's above the soil, and that represents this idea of humanity. So whatever we're doing, whatever arts, so whatever career or scholarship we're developing, we have to bring it back down to this idea of humanity, which is a sensitivity to the feelings of others. And Confucius advocates that whatever we do, we always have to be cognizant of the consequences of our actions on others. So that's how we use our skills and our knowledge. So let's use a very simple example to put these ideas into perspective. Now, imagine if you're working as an accountant. Well, you can also be involved in Confucian learning. How? Accountancy is your art. And these skills and knowledge in which you are immersed in for your entire workday. Now, if you are able to use your skills for transparent reporting and due diligence for the company and community, then that's humanity. So 2 accountants could be equally competent and intelligent, but that's not enough. Confucius tells us that it's the one who uses their skills with humanity who will succeed and live a fulfilling life in the long run. Now, there's actually some modern evidence in relation to this. Professor of psychology at Cornell University and former president of the American Psychological Association, Robert Sternberg, discusses how just simply teaching analytical skills and intelligence at schools is not enough. And he discusses 6 fallacies of the intelligent by using Enron as an example. So the first is unrealistic optimism. So intelligent people without this idea of humanity will believe that whatever they do will work out, like the executives at Enron, creating shell companies to hide their losses. Second fallacy is being egocentric, so only thinking about their own self-profit, enriching themselves to the detriment of shareholders, customers in the community. Omniscience, which is not knowing what they don't know. Omnificence, thinking they can do whatever they want and get away with it, like fraudulent accounting. Omnipotence, which is thinking they can do whatever they want, like cooking the books, insider trading. And ultimately, ethical disengagement, so blatantly ignoring the ethical implications of their actions. And Sternberg concludes that the smarter they were, the more they thought that they were immune. And this makes us think of what Confucius said about someone who had the talents of the Duke of Zhou. But if they were arrogant, what does that mean? It means that they think they know everything. They'd be blinded to their own weaknesses, their faults, and they wouldn't listen to anyone. So ultimately, that would create problems down the track for themselves, the people around them, and their company. So Sternberg argues for the teaching of wisdom, and he proposes a very widely accepted, balanced theory of wisdom. And the definition in a nutshell is here. So wisdom involves the ability to use one's intelligence in the service of a common good by balancing one's own interests with those of other people and of a broader community over both the short and long terms. Now, you can see at the very core of his theory of wisdom is really about thinking of others and of the common good. And in Confucian terms, that would be humanity. So Confucian learning, as you can see, is not about any particular subject matter, unless, of course, you want to be a sinologist, but it teaches us how to use our knowledge, similar to what Sternberg is advocating about the teaching of wisdom. How to use our knowledge, whatever that might be, to think about why we're doing what we're doing, what's the underlying motive, and what is the overarching goal? So how can we fit what we're doing into the bigger picture of greater humanity or even the natural world and environment? And by being mindful of these various questions, we'll develop meaning and fulfillment in our lives, not only in our study and work life, but it has flow-on effects for our mental well-being. And then we can really enjoy what we're doing. Now, I've only really talked about the top of the tree and the trunk. Confucian learning actually has a deeper dimension. Unlike the trunk that has a part under the soil that leads to the roots, if we continue to practice and develop our humanity, that leads us to our virtue and the way. So the virtue and the way are represented, you could say, by the roots of the tree, using that metaphor again. So because the roots are underneath the soil, it's mostly invisible. And that's somewhat like our heart and our mind, the thoughts in our mind. Even though we can't see them, they actually connect us to everyone and everything around us, just like how the roots connect us to the earth. So it's a heart of care that makes us reach out to others. And it's a mind of concern that makes us think about the natural environment. And this is very important in understanding Confucian learning. Virtue, you could say, refers to this common good, and the way is this interconnectedness with other people. Now, I'd like to spend some time talking a bit about the way, because it is such a central concept in Confucian and Chinese thought. But we're going to talk about the Confucian perspective on the way. And most people think it's quite abstract, but actually it's very practical. So the way, or Dao in Chinese, according to early dictionaries like the Erya, essentially meant a single direct path without any crossroads or fork roads like the picture here. And then it took on a more abstract meaning of maybe a principle that we follow in our lives. And then during the times of Confucius, it took on a philosophical concept of the way, a natural order in which all things, people, and events flourish. So if we follow this way, then we will realize our potential, but we'll be in harmony with all other things as well. Now, obviously, we're most interested in the way of human living. So let's take a look at that. The way of human living is realized through our various relationships. And Confucian thought boils down these relationships into 5 fundamental relationships: in the family, between parent and child, between partners and siblings, and in the workplace or in the community, between leader and team member, and friends. Now, if we break these relationships further down, you'll get 10 different roles with their inherent obligations. So for example, a parent who nurtures, cares, and teaches their child, that's this concept of compassion. And when the parent is able to do that in that moment, in that thought, in that attitude of compassion, that is the way. Similarly, a child who is mindful of the feelings and thoughts of their parents, known as family reverence or filial piety. In that moment, in that thought, that is the way. And you can see through the other various roles, there are also related virtues. Now, it's not only in our relationships with others, but also living creatures and even the environment, this idea of benevolence or humanity. And if we're able to do that, that is also the way. Now, despite the many roles and the many virtues that you can see on the slide, there is an underlying principle, and I wonder if you can see it. It is an underlying interconnectedness and a oneness that we share with others. So this is well encapsulated in the character for humanity. So the character for humanity is made up of 2 parts, the left and the right. On the left is the character for human, or really representing ourselves. And on the right is the character for 2, representing all others. So if we can think of all others at the same time as we think of ourselves, then that's humanity. And we do this, we put ourselves in to think from their perspective, but we also do this to the extent where we see others as ourselves. Now, what do I mean by this? It's like the parent who's able to, forego sleep and change dirty nappies without taking issue, because they actually see the child as part of themselves, as one with them. And so similarly, if we can do that, this attitude of oneness, this thought, that is the way in that moment. So it doesn't matter whether we're looking at a person, a parent, a child, or something in the environment. If we are mindful of that oneness, then we are seeing the way. So it doesn't sound as abstract as you think, this idea of the way, but it is ultimately this underlying interconnectedness. Now, we've looked at all the parts of this idea of Confucian learning, and you can see that it is very practical. Whatever we're doing, our careers, our scholarship, this is the arts. And whatever we do, we have to use our knowledge and skills in a consideration for those around us. And this is the idea of humanity, thinking of others. Virtue is ultimately thinking of the common good. But why do we need to do that? And that's because of the way, which is how we're actually interconnected, just like all the trees are actually connected to the greater earth. But this idea of the way or interconnectedness actually has parallels with other traditions. Professor of Philosophy and Theology, Janis Oslins, writes in his book about the original aim of education in both the East and the West. And he explains that there indeed is a sense of at a deep level, the world can be understood as rational. And this deep rationality can be characterized as the way or the Tao in Chinese philosophy, the Logos, the Alpha Omega, the God, and the Christ in Christianity. In other words, all of these various traditions, philosophical and faith traditions, are educating for us to understand and realize this interconnectedness that we share in a deeper order in the universe. And so he says that it is our contention that the central core of wisdom is being able to see the interconnectedness of things, and hence being able to make decisions that contribute not only to our own good, but also the common good. So again, this idea, even though he's talking about wisdom, this idea of thinking about others and thinking of this common good, and ultimately at a deeper level, the way. And this is very well illustrated by a passage or conversation in the Analects. So Confucius asks one of his students, Zigong, he says, "Do you think that I study a lot of different matters, so pieces of knowledge, and just commit them to memory?" And Zigong replies, "Yes, isn't that the case?" Confucius then says, "No, I have one thread that links it all together." So Confucian learning is not about this idea of accumulating facts or knowledge or skills. It's actually about finding the integration and assimilation of all our knowledge and finding that interconnectedness. It requires us to reflect on what we've learned and to connect the dots, which is actually very satisfying on an intellectual level. But Confucian learning is more than just on the intellectual level. As you could probably see from the previous passages, it's also on a social, emotional, and even a moral level. This fulfillment arises because we make our knowledge fruitful by adding value to our interactions, making our relationships meaningful and mutually beneficial, and then really getting back to the roots. So Confucian learning, as you can see, is actually inseparable from all parts of our lives and all stages of our lives. So that's this humanistic education and learning. The second point, or the second element then, is to apply this learning. Confucius tells us we have to apply it. It's not rote learning. So here in this passage, he says, consider someone who can recite the 300 odes. Now, 300 odes, it sounds like a lot. And also, it's actually referring to a classic, the canon or the classic of poetry, which was used in Confucius's times as a manual of political philosophy and extensively quoted in diplomacy. So he says, there's someone who can recite all of these odes, but you give them an official post and they're not up to the task. You send them on a diplomatic mission, but they're incapable of dialogue. So what is the use of all this vast learning? In other words, Confucius tells us that reciting is not enough. We have to digest this knowledge. We have to understand the meaning and apply it in our daily lives. First of all, in our interactions with others, and then ultimately at the highest echelons of power, in the highest arenas of interstate relations. And this is interesting because Robert Sternberg also talks about this kind of application of knowledge. He calls it tacit knowledge. He says, when to apply our knowledge, where, how, whom, and why, this is the stuff of tacit knowledge. So they're not and cannot be directly taught in school lessons. They're lessons learned from experience. So yes, they can be taught from, that we can learn from textbooks or lectures, but they're not directly taught from these textbooks or lectures. In other words, we have to bring these teachings to life. We have to live them, take them out of the textbook, put them in the context of our modern lives. So this is this idea of application. Now, the Chinese character for practice or application that's used in this passage in the Analects is also very telling. It helps us understand what practice means. So here I've provided two scripts. At the top is the ancient script, which is the small seal script. And at the bottom is how we currently write the character for practice. As you can see, it's made up of two parts, the top and the bottom. Now, at the top is actually the character for feathers. It's meant to resemble a bird's feathers. And why is that? Well, because this character originally connoted a young bird learning to fly. What's that got to do with practice? I wonder if you've ever seen a young bird learn to fly. Now, if you have, you'll know that the parent bird takes the young bird to a higher ground or a ledge, and then the parent bird will stand in front of the young bird and flap its wings. The young bird will imitate. Then after a while, the parent bird will fly off, and the young bird will try to fly off and imitate. What happens is that they land flat on the ground. What do they do next? Well, they simply pick themselves up and repeat the whole process again and again and again and again, day after day after day, until one day they flap their wings and they fly into the sky and they soar high and higher. And that's when they've fully achieved and realized their practice. Now, what does the practice of birds got to do with humanity or humans? Well, it's very interesting because there's, say, 3 points that we can learn from this. First of all, in this process of practicing, we will make mistakes. That's a certainty. But we must not give up. Like the bird that simply picks itself off the ground and continues trying. The bird doesn't give up. And ultimately, the third point is that we will succeed. If we don't give up, we will succeed. So that's this idea of practice and the idea that we need to keep going. But what are we practicing? Well, we're practicing and applying the mindset that we learn from texts like the Analects. So to give you an example, Confucius says in chapter 4, when you see a worthy person, think about how you can equal them. When you see an unworthy person, reflect on your own conduct. Now, notice that there's nothing theoretical or academic about this. It's related to how we interact with others and our mindset on a daily basis. Now, it might sound simple, but some people, when they see others being more virtuous or competent, they feel jealous or they feel annoyed that they have to be compared to that person. Confucius tells us here that it'd be more productive to examine the strengths of others and see how we can emulate them, because we can't control others. We can only improve ourselves. And similarly, when we see an unworthy person, some people would judge them, disapprove of them. Confucius tells us that it would be more productive to see their faults, but then reflect immediately on ourselves. And even if we have these faults on a minor level, we should try to change ourselves. So in other words, this person serves as a useful reminder for us. Now we understand the theory. How do we practice? Well, every time we meet others, we have to practice. It's like the bird flapping its wings. If we start to feel jealous or judgmental, then we've failed. We've fallen flat on the ground. But if we realize our thoughts, we can pick ourselves up, reset our mentality, and start again. Start from scratch. See the strengths of this person. Reflect on ourselves. The very act of changing our thoughts is application. That is the practice. And if we keep doing this until one day we automatically rejoice at another person's strengths and we self-reflect when we see someone else's faults, then that's when we're flying. So reading the text, yes, that's very important because it gives us guidelines, but no amount of reading will help if we don't put it into practice. We need to immerse ourselves in the learning by actually applying it in our daily lives, in the way we interact with others and conduct our different tasks. And it's only then that we'll really realize the meaning and really get it. So in Chinese, there's this word, 心得, which is mind and getting it. But the reality is, what are we getting? You know, we're not attaining any superpowers. We just realized something that was already there. You know, if we think back to that previous example, we could always rejoice in the strengths of others. We could always reflect on our own faults and not judge or disapprove of others. But we weren't trying hard enough. We weren't practicing that. But that ability was always inside of us. So we're not getting anything. We're actually recovering our virtue. We're recovering our humanity and ultimately, at a deeper level, the way. So the importance of practice is also echoed by Mencius when he says that a carpenter or a carriage maker can pass on to another the rules of the craft, but he cannot make them skillful. Now, why is that? Well, it's sort of like a teacher who has a class of about 30 students, and they talk about how to write an essay. They teach all 30 of the students the different parts of the essay and all the structures, etc. But does that mean that all the students, every one of them, will be able to write an essay that achieves top marks? Well, obviously it's based on each person's individual efforts, and that comes down to practice. So the student who practices, the more they practice, the more they reflect, they get feedback, they can improve, and that's the person who achieves the top marks. So there's really no substitute for practice for any skill, like even writing an essay or craft, let alone this art of living and this art of being able to interact with others with harmony. And this is this idea of application. And then we turn to the third point, which is the time element, constancy. Now, ancient commentators have talked about how in different periods of the year, based on the curriculum, the students would have to learn different texts. And this would be this idea of time in the application of this learning. But for our purposes in the modern context, this constancy refers to persistence because Rome was not built in a day. It's not about how long I have to do this, but I think we should really ask ourselves, when do we want to start enjoying what we're doing? When do we want to start flying like that bird? And for many of us, the answer would be in every moment of our lives. And so that's when we have to practice. So that's why in the earliest writings on education in Chinese history, it's recorded in the records of ritual, there's this particular passage that says, as exemplary persons study, they gather knowledge from all sources, cultivate themselves within it, immerse themselves in it, even during their leisure and respite, and roam freely within it. So it's not just classroom learning, it's wherever they are, even in their spare time, any moment. And because of this, they find satisfaction in their learning. So this is this enjoyment, right? They grow closer to their teachers, their friends and their peers. So this is this humanistic education because they find meaning, they're able to relate better to people around them. And on top of that, they're ever more committed to the way, this interconnectedness, this underlying deep rationale of the universe. So what was their secret? It's learning and practice in all moments of the day, doing it wherever they are. And then they achieve this enjoyment. And this enjoyment is not a laugh out loud happiness. It's more sort of a quiet inner satisfaction. I mean, you know, do you think that the bird that was finally able to take flight, do you think that they were enjoying themselves? But they weren't laughing. It was just a quiet sense of achievement. And that's because we know inside that we've improved. We've improved in the way that we respond to matters, we respond to people. That's the enjoyment. And when we learn and practice, there are two responses in the outside world, from the outside. So first is positive, and that's to have friends coming from afar. And then it's a great delight. Now, this delight is different from the idea of enjoyment because enjoyment is internally derived, whereas delight is more derived from external factors, like as it says here, friends coming over. And it's also less in intensity. But the main point is, of course, that once we cultivate our humanity, others will naturally come to learn from us, and we can learn together. So the point is not about creating a name, trying to seek fame or popularity. It's about this idea of simply cultivating ourselves so much so that we can benefit others. And that's where the delight comes from. It's not about gaining more friends. It's actually about the fact that we can help others enjoy. We can benefit others, and that's what's so enjoyable. The second response is when we feel no discomposure. When people don't recognize us, but that doesn't impact and we don't feel annoyed. And then why is that? Well, because we're already enjoying ourselves. We already have this inner satisfaction, and that's not related to anything outside. It's like when we're sitting inside, and it doesn't matter whether it's rainy or sunny. If it's sunny, then yes, we could go outside and meet with friends and have a great chat. But if it's rainy, we continue staying inside. We've got our work to do. We're still feeling we're really satisfied with what we're doing inside. So it doesn't change our mindset at all. So that's this idea of not feeling any difference, regardless of what happens, how people respond. So ultimately, we come back to the question, how can we be like Confucius and enjoy our learning? First, reflect. Why am I doing this? And this is the learning bit, this idea of, you know, whatever I'm doing, how does it relate? See the connections. How does my knowledge and skills contribute to the greater community? And then ultimately practice. So apply the ideas from the classic texts and our different interactions. And do this constantly. Make the most of every moment, because that's when we can really see the benefits of this learning and practice. And, you know, regardless of whether at work or at home or studying, you can do this. And that's a really best thing about Confucian learning. So I'll stop there and open the floor for some questions. And in the next talk, we'll talk more about this idea of practice, but through etiquette. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine, for a very insightful and thorough presentation on the humanistic education that Confucian learned. Now, we have a little bit of time for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, or alternatively, you can type your question into the chat window. And I'll keep that open to monitor for questions. I've already been handed one question from the floor, Catherine, and it looks like you've piqued some interest. So I suppose this is the first question. I'm just checking the chat box. And the question is, where do we start in learning this humanistic education, in learning Confucianism?
That's a very good question, because I guess this talk was mainly about the theoretical aspects. Of course, when we talk about the Analects, it's one of the classics, but there are a number of texts that are called primers, which I'll talk about tomorrow in the third session. But essentially, we could always start with the primers, and these were actually developed for a younger audience, so people who are starting out like us, and things like the 弟子规, the guidelines for learners, things like 小儿语, in the words of children, further words of children, the 3-character classic. We can start off with those. And I guess this is in terms of learning. But if you're talking about practice, the idea of how we can start in our daily lives, then I would point you to the idea of etiquette or ritual etiquette, Li. That is actually how we put this learning into practice, which I'll cover next. So then there would be other texts. But generally, you would need to probably get your head around a few of the more basic texts, like the primers, 弟子规, 三字经, 孝经, so 3-character classic, classical family reverence, etc. That would give you some of these underlying concepts. And you can actually practice through them as well. So it's learning and practice together. Hopefully that.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I noticed that there was an Alex Chen has raised their hand. Would you like to maybe unmute yourself? You can put on the camera and ask your question directly.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Professor No. Thank you, everybody, for organizing this wonderful event. So I really enjoyed the lecture and learned a lot from it. And I had a quick question that came to mind and then a bigger question as well. So the quick question, I just wanted to confirm or check. Professor No mentioned, or Confucius mentioned, that there was one thread that connected all his teachings. Does this refer to humanity? That's the quick question. And then the other question, it's been kind of top of mind for me recently, which is, what do we do about students who are so stressed about their learning because they have to learn a bunch of knowledge or even ability, like the English IELTS test is an English ability. And they're just so stressed about it because in their mind, they think, well, I have to pass this test or else I won't be able to go to university and then I won't have a good future. And so if we tell them, well, you gotta enjoy it and practice it in your daily life and remember you're doing this, for the good of humanity, it kind of, I feel like it's not going into their head. So what do you do in that kind of situation, or what would Confucius advise there? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your 2 questions. That's really wonderful. First of all, I'm not a professor yet. Just simply Catherine's fine. So the first question, yes. So there has been quite a bit of debate about what exactly Confucius means about this one thread. So I guess the jury is still out. There is an earlier passage in the text which he talks to another student about what's this one thread in the Analects, and Zhengzi, who says that he says he knows it, and Confucius doesn't need to talk about it further. And then Zhengzi tells us it's zhong and shu, and these 2 words, if we were to translate them, zhong would be this idea of faithfulness, and shu would be this idea of reciprocity. And then people were saying, well, how come that's two things and that's not one thread, you know? But ultimately, at the end of the day, there are a lot of different virtues, right? We saw there was, every role has different virtues. Then you have reciprocity and other things in the Analects and other Confucian texts. But at the end of the day, it all goes down to one thing, which is the way. And this interconnectedness, this oneness that we have with others. So you could call it humanity, you could call it faithfulness, you could call it family reverence. It's actually really referring to the same thing, which is we think more of others rather than ourselves, to think of others and see others as ourselves until you get to the point where you see everyone and everything as this oneness. So it's sort of, the way I think about it is it's sort of like a sphere, and then all of the virtues are on around the sphere, and you're really getting, the deeper you go, if you can practice, for example, later I'll talk about family reverence, you can practice that at the very deepest level, comes down to one at the very core, and that's this idea of the way. So it has many manifestations, but ultimately there's only one. And if you want to talk about the way, how can we describe it? The way is just a name. It can't be named. It can't be thought about. This is feeling. So I don't know if I answered your question, but this is, you can't put a name on it. It's just this idea, this thought, this attitude. But the best way you could say it is this idea of being at one with the world, the nature, etc. That's the first answer. The second question that you had, also very good, because we've all been through those cramming for exams. Definitely, I remember. But I guess if I could do that process again, if I had learned this Confucian learning earlier in my life and gone through, high school, etc., high school examinations, when you really need to cram because you're thinking, I really need to get into a good course at university, etc. Then if you had this learning on top of that, where you are thinking about the fact that, you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for the people around you, etc., that doesn't actually make you more stressed. In fact, it helps you because it puts things into perspective. It's not just about that one number anymore. It actually tells you that it infuses what you're doing with meaning. It's not just, okay, here's 10 pages that I have to memorize. It's actually, well, there's 10 pages here. Well, what's the content and how can it help me for other things? So if, just to go back to your example about English, yes, I need to memorize all this grammar, all this vocabulary, but at the end of the day, I can talk to people, I can help people, I can use this for something good. It's not just for the exams. So if you change that mindset, it's not about the number, it's not about you, but it's about something that's bigger and better, then it actually does reduce the stress and the pressure. And if it doesn't, then it means you need to go back and try to think about it again. And that's a whole practice where you just keep, okay, you've read this wisdom of Confucius, oh, it's really good, I'm thinking about humanity, get back to the books, and then you feel stressed. Then you just have to keep practicing because that idea of thinking for ourselves, learning for ourselves is something that Confucius even talked about. He talked about how in the past, people would learn for themselves for their self-development. And these days, people learn for others. In other words, for the approval of others, for marks, etc. That's exactly what we're doing now. So actually, he has words of gold for us today too, because it was the same with him. So hopefully that helps. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Alex. I'm conscious of the time.
That was amazing. Thank you.
I'm conscious of the time, so I have to draw the first Q&A session to a close. Thank you again. Now, for the next presentation, next seminar, Catherine will be presenting on everyday Chinese etiquette. And her talk is entitled Shoes in a Melon Patch and Hat Under a Plum Tree. Catherine, thank you very much.
Thank you again. This is really sort of second part, really. It's not something that's separate. It can be thought of as the second part of learning, which is the practice, which is very, very important. So I'm glad that the Academy and the University have allowed me to also talk about this topic. Now, when we think of the word etiquette, when I think of the word etiquette, it brings back memories of my primary school days, when teachers would remind us to sit up straight, button our blazers, and cover our mouth if we yawned, sneezed, or coughed. There was even a teacher, I remember, Miss Fox, who wouldn't answer my requests unless I said yes, or unless I said please. So all of these codes of dress, conduct, and speech were drummed into us. And we were told that it was polite or respectful to do this. And sure enough, when we followed these codes of conduct, the adults around us would be very happy. But if we didn't follow these rules of conduct, like coughing without putting our hand over our mouth, then the adults around us would look really annoyed. Now, Confucian etiquette is somewhat similar. Confucian etiquette is in Chinese li. And it's interesting because there's no modern English term that can really encapsulate or capture all of the different concepts that fall under this banner of li. So, for example, it includes etiquette, like introducing ourselves, how to introduce ourselves to others. It includes social customs, like giving up our seat to an elderly person on the bus, ceremonies like weddings and funerals, and even manners, like what my teachers used to remind us of. The common denominator is that these are all human activities, codes of behavior and speech, or that are learned, and they express respect and also facilitate an internal reverence when we do these. So ritual etiquette, or li, I'll refer today as either ritual etiquette or simply etiquette. What I'll do is I'll first explain what this etiquette means, how it's important, and then give specific examples of what might be useful, examples of etiquette that might be useful for us today, even if we don't identify as Asian. Now, scholars have described li, or etiquette, as a social language or cultural grammar. And like any social language or any language or grammar, it has to be learned. We can't make it up. Just like we have to teach children to say their pleases and thank yous. They can't simply make up another word or gesture. And like any language, it expresses our thoughts and our emotions. So if you give me a present and I want to show my gratitude, the familiar script would be to say thank you. If I don't say thank you, you might think I'm not grateful. But etiquette is not any language. It's a language that expresses our consideration of others, this humanity that we were talking about before. And it expresses our respect of others. So that's why Confucius tells us in the classic of family reverence that ritual etiquette is simply a matter of respect. Now, if we think back to that idea of offering up our seat to someone who needs it more, we can think of it in three ways. First, there's self-respect, because it would be insensitive if we didn't give up our seat to an elderly person, a pregnant person, and we would be insensitive even if others didn't call us out. It's also respect for others, because really it's a matter of showing others, well, these people need the seat more than us, so we need to respect that. And then ultimately respect for the common good, which is this idea of caring for example, the elderly in the community. So ultimately, you can see that etiquette is about this idea of respect in our daily conduct. And you can see that the common good is actually just as important as the individual benefits. If all members of the community were to understand and practice etiquette, then it's thought that this would promote social cohesion. Contemporary philosopher Herbert Fingrid coined ritual etiquette as the sacred ceremony of human existence. And he argues that Confucius had a revelatory insight that our humanity could be realized through the simple daily acts of our interactions with others. And these acts would be refined through ritual etiquette. Now, Herbert Fingrid provides a very interesting modern example of etiquette, or ritual etiquette. He says, I see you on the street, I smile, walk towards you, put out my hand to shake yours, and without any effort on my part to make you do so, you spontaneously turn toward me, return my smile, raise your hand towards mine, and we shake hands by spontaneous and perfect cooperative action. Now, normally, we don't notice the subtlety and amazing complexity of this coordinated ritual act. So there's this reciprocation and coordination of the handshake because both parties recognize this etiquette. And social harmony doesn't occur because I demand it from you, but because I myself engage in this etiquette. I take the initiative. So if I stretch out my hand, you instinctively know what to do. So etiquette, yes, it's a social code, but at the same time, it's an individual effort. If we make this individual effort, then this manifests our consideration of others. It manifests our inner character. Just like a handshake at the end of a sports match shows our sportsmanship. Now, before I go on, I have to make a disclaimer. I'm not the most polite person, and many of my friends and colleagues would be much more qualified to talk about politeness and etiquette. But thankfully, we're not going to be learning from my personal experiences. We're going to be learning from the best, the texts themselves. So the text that I will be using today for this talk is called The Essentials of Daily Etiquette, in Chinese, 常理举要. Now, this text was compiled in the 1980s, but it actually sort of selects the most essential, the basic guidelines from ancient ritual texts. And it was compiled by Professor Li Bingnan, who was a very eminent Confucian and Buddhist scholar. He was, in fact, the chief secretary to the ceremonial official to Confucius, which is an official government position that was generally held by the descendants of Confucius for over 2,000 years now. It's currently being served by the 79th generation descendant of Confucius. Professor Li taught at various universities and educational institutions. And the amazing thing is that he continued to lecture throughout his retirement and even into his 90s. So it was in his 90s, in the last years of his life, and after a lifetime career of Confucian scholarship, that he compiled The Essentials of Daily Etiquette. It contains instructions that are deceptively simple, like, when two people are talking, don't interrupt them. And it begs the question, why would he spend the last years of his life in his 90s compiling such a basic text on etiquette? He was a highly cultivated individual, and we would expect someone of his cultivation and learning to be very patient and forgiving. So it wasn't because he was being constantly offended by the younger people around him and he wanted to teach them a lesson. Instead, it was because he realized through his experiences and his learning that the path to more excellence and this utmost excellence as humanity is actually through the simple details of the interactions in our life. And this is actually grounded in the ancient texts. So there's this time when Confucius's best student, Yan Hui, asked Confucius how to cultivate humanity. Now, Confucius pointed to etiquette. Humanity is that core virtue we were talking about before. It's a value that Confucius asked his students to aspire to, but he himself did not admit to mastering this particular virtue of humanity. So what exactly did he say? He said, master oneself, recover ritual etiquette. Sounds like two things, but it's actually one. So if we are able to follow these codes of conduct, this ritual etiquette, we are in fact mastering ourselves. And you can see, of course, that this recovering is not reinstating etiquette in law, in the laws or in a handbook, but actually engaging in etiquette ourselves. And that's because the path to moral excellence, this humanity, was not on a mountain retreat, but through the moments in our daily life. And so humanity, as Confucius says, is expressed through our etiquette, but it is also achieved through etiquette. So Professor Li saw firsthand the importance of etiquette, and he compiled the very basic guidelines for the modern time-poor reader. If we actually printed out this text in size 12 font, it'd only take up about 7 pages, but it's divided into 12 sections. At home, at school, attending to matters and meals, when you step outside of the house, visiting others, hosting guests when you're traveling, in public spaces, gifting others, in certain ceremonies like weddings or funerals, and terms of address. Now you might be wondering, is this for is it for children or for adults? Well, yes, there might be this particular section on schools, classroom conduct, but actually it's more targeted towards adults because it's adults who host guests and travel. So it's really targeted towards daily matters in adult life. But obviously, the earlier we learn about this, the better it'll be because we'll make less social blunders. And this is exactly what Professor Li talks about in his preface, which I'd like to explore with you now. Because when you read the preface, it's almost like a great-grandfather talking to a younger person, sort of straight from the heart. He compiled this book not for commercial sale, but for free public use and learning. So this is what he says. He says, etiquette is crucial within groups. So once you get humans together in a group, you'll need etiquette. How to greet others, how to deal and interact with others. And he says, even the most uncivilized ethnic group will have a set of etiquette. Etiquette is the force underlying how we communicate, our emotions, how we deal with matters, and also even the stability of nations. But Professor Li is under no illusion that people today think etiquette is outdated. And, people think that it's too complicated. Why bother? Or it's just quite superficial. And why do we need to learn about politeness when actually sincerity speaks from the heart? So that's why he asks us to imagine. He says, imagine if a guest comes over today. Tomorrow you visit someone. You give a present, you host a dinner. You have to give your condolences or attend a meeting. Actually, all of these events and occasions still require us to use etiquette. And without this learning, who knows what to do? So, for example, if you're hosting a dinner, how do you seat the guests? How do you plan the menu? Receive and send off the guests? This is all etiquette. How do you, when you have to think about giving a gift? What do you give? How much do you give? So this is why we need etiquette. And he says, let's say we don't bother. We don't know what to do, so let's ignore etiquette. Listen for what comes next. You'll be labeled with all of these different phrases. He says, who does that? This person is so rude, so uncivilized. They don't know anything. They're so disrespectful and simply unfeeling. How laughable, and don't associate with them. And he says, as a result, all your future prospects will be tainted because you've offended someone. So there are a lot of people who disapprove of etiquette, but they still take off their hat and bow and shake hands. So he was writing in Taiwan in the 1980s, so reason for bowing. And if you entered the office without knocking, they'd be annoyed. If you didn't say thank you when you received their guests, they might be offended. And this is contradictory because they're saying that we should do away with the formalities, but yet they adhere to them and they get offended. And so he concludes by saying that he himself has encountered many difficulties in his life and suffered setbacks. And success cannot be attained without etiquette. He says he's most concerned about the younger generation who do not understand etiquette and will inevitably suffer misfortune. As a result, I've selected some common forms of etiquette as a reference. Etiquette is a preventative measure, moral quality, an act of respect, badge of honor, and is imperative to understand. So without further ado, let's take a look at some specific examples. You might be wondering why the title of the talk is Shoes in a Melon Patch and Hats Under the Plum Tree. Well, actually, this is related to etiquette. In the section on attending to matters, there's an instruction that says, do not tie one's shoelaces in a melon patch and do not adjust one's hat under a plum tree. Now, why is that? Well, these actions in themselves, like tying our shoelaces or adjusting our hat, they're not inappropriate, but it's just easily misinterpreted if someone was watching us from a distance. So say, for example, you're walking through someone else's melon patch, and for some reason you need to tie your shoelaces, but they simply see you amongst the melons. So what would be their first thought? Well, they're going to assume the worst. They're going to think that you're trying to make away with someone else's melons. Because why else would you be in that position? So they would be forgiven for thinking about this because for them, it's very difficult to think of another reason. You're the one with your shoelaces loose. And similarly, if you're under a plum tree and you're stretching up to adjust your hat, well, from a distance, they'll just see your arms stretched up. And again, they'll jump to conclusions, thinking that you're picking some of these plums for yourself. So it's just the wrong time in the wrong place, and it leads to misunderstandings. Now, you might say, well, we're not going to be walking through someone else's melon patch or under someone else's plum tree anytime soon. But the underlying principle applies wherever you are, that etiquette teaches us to avoid conduct, be very cautious and avoid conduct that would be easily misinterpreted. Now, if we wanted to put this principle in a specific context, there are two lines in the section on giving gifts that might help us. First of all, it says, all gifts must be wrapped unless they are for weddings, funerals, or birthdays. Second, when giving a gift generally, one should avoid other guests seeing or hearing this. Only when one has traveled from afar or on a first meeting can one give gifts in front of other guests. So, as it says here, why do we have to wrap up our gifts? The answer is in the second line. Because we should try to avoid others from seeing the gift or from seeing us give the gift. But there are exceptions to this rule. There are obviously special occasions when gifts are expected, like it says here. Weddings, funerals, birthdays, housewarming parties, Christmas parties, etc. I'm sure you can think of more. But imagine turning up to a birthday without a gift. So clearly, it's these special occasions where you need to bring something, and that wouldn't be unexpected. Now, in the Essentials, it also talks about 2 other occasions where traditionally you might also bring a gift. For example, after coming home from travels, it's expected that you'd bring a small gift or souvenir for friends and family. Also, when you visit someone's house for the first time, in an Asian context, it's customary to bring something small like fruit. So in these situations, it would be expected that you bring something. So it doesn't matter whether it's wrapped or unwrapped. But the problem is if you're giving a gift outside of these occasions. So let's imagine you see your colleague hand a gift bag to your boss. Then a few days later at the work meeting, this colleague is especially praised by the boss. Now, is this some sort of coincidence, or were they trying to curry favor with the boss? Actually, it could be something completely innocent, like the boss asking them to help them buy a gift for a friend. But it's like the melon patch, isn't it? Wrong place, wrong time, and it leads to misunderstandings. Now, from a professional point of view, there are certainly some professions, like those in public office, who have to refuse gifts. But this particular instruction about gift giving is really for our daily lives, so even amongst friends. Imagine if you see friend A give friend B a gift. You might be wondering, what's the occasion? Are they getting special treatment? And didn't I know them for longer? So yes, some would say that, you're thinking too much, and I'm an honest person. And, yes, my friend honestly asked me to help them buy a gift. So I don't have a guilty conscience. And this actually gets to the very heart of Confucian etiquette. You see, it's not about what we think and our thoughts and feelings. It's about what others might think and giving others around us peace of mind. So this ritual etiquette helps us, like we said before, to balance out what we think with the ideas of others and ultimately this common good. So as Confucius explains here in the Analects, we have to know how to proceed on the analogy of what's close at hand. So what's close at hand is our own feelings. Put ourselves in the shoes of others. How would we feel if we were in their situation and we saw someone giving that gift? But also we might think of what our friends or family, how would they react if they were in that situation? And that helps us, helps give us some perspective of, what others might be thinking, what I think, what people around me might think, and their reactions. So if we can do that, then this is what's called the approach to humanity. It helps us practice and realize this humanity, because it's not all about us. Now, there are also a number of instructions I'd like to share with you about visiting others, the time to visit them, how to prevent embarrassment, and reading their body language. So first of all, the timing. Do not visit during sleep or meal times. Now, this sounds like common sense, but actually it requires a sensitivity and awareness of the other person's routine. So if we're unaware, we can obviously make some generalizations. For example, could be anytime before 7 a.m. on a weekday, later on a weekend, anytime after 10 o'clock at night for the sleep times. But obviously these are all adjustable, adaptable, and dynamic to the times. And if you know your friend, you might know that they might sleep very late. So at the end of the day, it's not just about personally visiting. In the modern context these days, it could also be contacting them by phone, email, or message. So we're not physically visiting them, but we're simply communicating with them. And we still need to be respectful of their time. For example, if it's work-related, then we should try to contact them during work hours. Don't write to them at 7 p.m. at night, nor at 4 p.m. or 4:50 p.m. on a Friday afternoon and expect them to help you out. Now, it sounds very simple, but the in-office and out-of-office lines are becoming increasingly blurred as people work from home. And we almost expect our colleagues to always be in front of their screens, whether it's the mobile or the computer. When we expect communication outside of office hours, it's actually a very subtle thought. It's a thought that, I should get what I want when I want it. So rather than thinking of ourselves, we should be more mindful of the other person. If they're at home, there are other things that they might need to do: cooking, cleaning, looking after family members, etc. So, or they could have other work items, other colleagues giving them things to do. So this particular instruction, it's not just about sleep or meal times, it's about respecting the other person, respecting their time, and their time away from their computer or mobile. So in terms of applying this in modern day life, it would also include just simple etiquette about communicating to others during work hours. Now, there's also an instruction about respecting people's personal space and preventing embarrassment. So there was as it states here, before entering a room, one should first make ourselves heard so that those inside know someone is approaching. So this is very important. You could be working in the same building and you just need to go over to their office for something, maybe a casual chat. Maybe you haven't made an appointment. But before you enter the room, you should knock and call out so that they can hear you and they know that someone's about to come in. These precious moments before you see them is very important because they could have something private and confidential on their desk or their screen or in the room. Or it could be a need to tidy things up. Regardless, giving them those few seconds where they can just adjust things prevents embarrassment. And it's also about respecting their personal space. Then there are certain tips which I would like to call taking a hint kind of etiquette. So it says that when you're visiting someone and you're talking to them, but other guests come, promptly take one's leave. If the host yawns, stretches, or looks at the time, one should also promptly take one's leave. In other words, we shouldn't wait to have to be asked to leave. We should be aware of the other person's time and space. Be really sensitive to their body language and don't overstay our welcome. Take the initiative yourself to end the meeting. Then there's a certain etiquette that's related to the interaction between host and guest. So it states here, after finishing the meal, the host expresses self-deprecation while guests express gratitude. Now, if you've ever been in an Asian setting, you might find that after a meal or an event, the host will apologize that, the hospitality really hasn't been the best. And this is actually a cue for the guest to then say that, they've really enjoyed themselves and, they're really thankful for great hospitality. And there are some fun traditional phrases that works in Chinese. So the host will say something like, giving unpolished rice or a spread of straw dishes. And unpolished rice and straw dishes is really referring to the humble fare of the poor. The guest then replies by saying, no, this meal has been cooked with gold and gems, which is a metaphor for lavish delicacies. Now, what does this actually achieve? No, each party should be thinking about the other person and not focusing on themselves. So rather than the host thinking, I've really gone, pulled all stops to create this food, the best drink and the best entertainment for these people, and therefore they should be really grateful. And because they have this attitude in their mind, they feel really self-important. So being humble about what they've offered prevents them from this sense of arrogance and self-importance, which might come across as offensive. And then the guest, rather than thinking of, I've been served better elsewhere and the food was really not up to scratch. Rather than thinking that, they should be focusing on the host and how much effort that they put in to organize this, and therefore acknowledge and appreciate that. So the effort, this etiquette, as you can see, really promotes a mutual harmony and mutual appreciation and goodwill. And actually, there's a deeper underlying principle to all of this. And this is well expressed in the records of ritual. It says, regarding ritual etiquette, humble oneself and respect others. In fact, this is the guiding principle for all forms of etiquette and interactions. So this particular etiquette in the literature has been classified as a type of politeness phenomenon in the field of pragmatics. And Gu Yueguo, he wrote a seminal paper noting 4 elements of this politeness principle: respectfulness, modesty, attitudinal warmth, and refinement. So first of all, respectfulness is about our positive appreciation of others. And this concept of the other is not simply about their physical self, but also involves their face, their status, their ideas, their property, and even members of their family. Modesty is a way of being self-deprecating, being humble. But this self-deprecation, again, is not just yourself, it's your ideas, your values, and your property as well. Attitudinal warmth refers to this idea of demonstrating one's consideration and hospitality. And finally, refinement refers to our behavior, which meets standards of etiquette. So in conclusion, Gu Yueguo highlights that the core of ritual in language is this idea of deference to others, so humility, and this deference to others, which is obviously this respect, and then denigration of the self, which is humility. In another study, which looked at historical letters written in China during the 18th to the 20th century, Pan and Kadir also corroborated this twofold linguistic strategy of self-deprecation and elevation of the addressee, and they called it the motor of politeness behavior. So obviously in pre-modern China, there were a number of honorifics. So for example, another's children would be referred to in very complimentary terms. For example, a vessel for the nation, which refers to this child having the competence to serve the state and really be a pillar for the nation. They could also be complimented by being called a pearl in the palm, like a prized jewel. So this particular politeness principle can be seen in the act of giving gifts as well. So as it says in the Essentials of Daily Etiquette, when gifting others, one must be humble and respectful. So no matter how valuable the gift is, how much time and effort we put into choosing it, into wrapping it, etiquette tells us to downplay our efforts and let the receiver be the judge. So, obviously in English, we would say things like, oh, this is just something small. And this is the same in Chinese. This is cue then for the recipient to reciprocate with appreciation. And then, you know, they would say something like, oh, you know, you've gone to so much trouble, you really shouldn't have, etc., etc. Now, you might be thinking, is this just all superficial pretense? You know, you say something, I say something. But actually, if you think about it on a deeper level, it keeps us grounded. It prevents us from making assumptions like, you know, we've given them the most valuable gift, just in case the recipient may not necessarily have the same view. So this is the politeness principle in action. But why is this important? I'd like you to take a step back and think about the way we interact with others generally. Studies show us that the first impressions of someone are made in the first 1/10 of a second that we meet them. And these impressions include things like their attractiveness, their likability, trustworthiness, competence, and aggressiveness. And so if we think about that, actually our responses to others are rooted in sort of very quick, impressionistic, and incomplete knowledge about the other person. What we do is when we make these impressions, when we form these first impressions, we sort of divide people into my sort of person and the others. So with people who we might like, well, we think that they're very likable, then we immediately are more generous, are more humble, respectful, and, you know, we can express our humanity with these people. But for the others, we might look down on them, act dismissively, and disapprove of them. Now, these evaluations might be useful if they were actually accurate, but they're not. And, you know, I'm sure from our own personal experiences, we would have realized that people who we think were really kind might turn out to be mean. And some people who we thought were generous might actually end up being stingy. So that's because these assumptions that we make about others are based on stereotypes. And the result being that the interactions we have with others end up being insensitive or even rude. So this is where humility and respect come into the picture. Amy Albertine, who's a professor of philosophy, in her recent book about the wrong of rudeness, talks about how this politeness principle is so important. So she says, Confucius encourages me to recognize that I have these tendencies, conscious and unconscious, to size others up, and that these tendencies need to be resisted by developing our humility, this politeness principle. So she says, I accord with conventional behaviors, and these significantly enact the humility I seek to cultivate in myself. So I simultaneously treat others with greater humility, and I influence my own internal dispositions towards greater humility. So by engaging in etiquette, yes, you might think it's a pretense that we're just trying to be humble, but actually it helps us develop our humility at the end of the day. So these hasty impressions and responses that we make are like a circuit. And if you think about it, etiquette trips the circuit. So we can engage in a way that's more open to learning from others and really appreciating them for what they have to offer. And this ultimately generates better social dynamics. Amy Albertine also talks about an assignment that she gives to her undergraduate students. She says how she tells them to be Confucians when they go home on Thanksgiving break. So she's in America. And this idea of Confucianism or being a Confucian is obviously, first of all, engaging in etiquette, but also, like we talked about previously, this idea of living up to our roles. So, you know, as a child, as a grandchild, as a sibling, a friend, etc. So really sort of putting into practice these ideas. And she says that rather than sort of thinking about how it ruins their break because it's quite demanding, she says that I've yet to find a student who enjoyed their break less. They uniformly return attesting to having felt closer, more bonded, in better accord with their families, and yet they likewise and significantly note that the assignment became easier as the break progressed. And that's not because they became Confucians or so swiftly habituated to this politeness, but rather it grew easier because of how uncommonly pleasant their families were to them. So what does this tell us? Well, if we behave towards others, how we behave towards others is actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we expect them to be mean, well, we're going to act disdainfully towards them and then cause them to be unkind to us in response. It is, if we act with courtesy, then others will also reciprocate with this respect. And it is, as Mencha said, one who loves others will always be loved. One who respects others will always be respected. And so this helps us understand the rest of that passage in the Analects. So let's return to that conversation that Confucius had with Yanhui, his best student. So we read the beginning, how Confucius said to master oneself and restore ritual etiquette, but then he continues by saying that if we can do so for one day, the whole world will return to humanity. And the practice of humanity proceeds from oneself. How could it proceed from others? This idea of practicing humanity and the impact that it has on others is quite astounding. And you may even doubt the words of Confucius. How can I have this impact on the whole world? It might be the case for a state leader. Their words and actions in one day could change the fate of the nation. But what about for the individual? Well, for us, we actually have this immediate impact on the people around us as well. And on a deeper level, over time, that impact can be further extended throughout those in the community. So ultimately, Confucius emphasizes at the very end that it's up to us because we have full ownership of our own thoughts, words, and actions, and we ask nothing of others and only of ourselves. So let's think of a specific example. And you can actually try this at home. In fact, you should try this at home. Hand something to others. So it could be a book, it could be a cup, and do it with both hands. And then ask that person to hand it back to you and receive it with both hands. And that is actually this particular instruction here in the Essentials of Daily Etiquette. It says, when an elder hands over something, one should receive it with both hands. This idea of the elder is really talking about someone who's more senior in status or age. And when it's talking about receiving, it's actually talking about both giving and receiving. So it's equally applicable. Now, this idea of using both hands, what does that achieve? Well, when you do it, you'll realize that using both hands automatically focuses our mind. And immediately you become more cautious, more reverential. And that attitude is conveyed to the other person. And it changes the attitude of the other person as well. So our actions can have an immediate effect on others. Now you might be thinking, well, yes, I can see that connection now, but how is it that these actions, seemingly mechanical, can help us internalize these feelings? Because ultimately, etiquette is not just about emotions, it's actually about transforming these polite words and actions into an internal sense of respect and empathy. So how does it work? Well, we actually have to use our mind. We have to really reflect on what we're doing. So another word, a really good word in Chinese, 用心, literally means use our heart or engage our mind. So that's what we need to do. It's not just about going through the motions, saying these words like a script. And if we can do that, then it actually has, over time, a very slow but steady change on us internally. it takes time and it's not acquired immediately. That's the whole reason for the need for practice. Professor of philosophy, Karen Lai, talks about this whole process in 3 stages. First, this need to memorize and practice and really follow simple instructions. It's this idea where, it seems a bit awkward when you have to always almost look at the books and think about what I should be doing in the situation. And, if the situation changes slightly, you almost feel like you don't know what to do. So that's the first stage where you're sort of following these instructions. The second stage is when you actually have an idea about them now, and then you can reflect and even experiment. And then finally, there's the stage where you've analyzed it and you feel completely at ease. And this is the same for any skill. Like, if you're playing a musical instrument, dance, writing an essay, and practicing etiquette. So these later stages are the stages where you actually enjoy yourself, because you no longer have to think about the rules. You can be more spontaneous. It's more fluid and dynamic. It's like when we look at an Olympic athlete, and they've probably been practicing that same motion countless times over the months and years. And then when they do it, it seems so effortless. And for them, they probably don't even need to think about it anymore. So that's why Confucius told us that at the age of 70, he could follow all the desires of his heart without breaking any rule. And this rule refers, of course, to this idea of etiquette. So in other words, Confucius could do anything, and that would naturally accord with etiquette, and that would facilitate social cohesion and express reverence. And now we come full circle, in fact, to the very first passage of the Analects, in which Confucius tells us that learning and constantly applying this learning is most enjoyable, because learning goes hand in hand with the practice. And this practice at the beginner level is really just applying simple daily etiquette, because it helps us express respect, but also helps us develop this consideration for the feelings of others. So it's not simply going through the motions. The more we tap into this feeling, the more we realize it's not the etiquette, but this feeling of being connected to a greater consideration, a greater common good that's beyond ourselves. And then over time, it becomes natural, effortless, and we really enjoy it. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Insightful talk on the essence of etiquette and its intricacies. Well, as before, we have some time for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, or you can type your question into the chat window. Now, to kick us off, I have a question right here. Let's get the piece of paper. The question is, in our modern day interactions, we communicate with each other in so many different ways. We use, text messages these days, a lot of shorthand writing, emojis, emoticons, stickers even. So would you say that, this idea of etiquette, let alone ritual etiquette, is a lot, old-fashioned now? It's getting outdated, on the decline, Catherine? What do you think?
Yes, that's a very good question, because I guess like Professor Liebingham in his time in the 1980s, he was also saying that people were feeling that ritual etiquette was outdated and no one wanted to learn it. But actually, when just by covering a few of these instructions in this text, we can see that it's actually very applicable. Of course, there are some that you might find very specific to certain situations, like the idea of bowing or something like that, which you think, doesn't apply anymore. But the important thing about this etiquette is that it has an underlying principle. So this idea of gift giving that we said before was really this idea of respecting others and humbling oneself, which is then applicable to all situations and not just the idea of gift giving. So there are, you could say, with further study and further analysis of these ritual instructions, you'll actually realize that the principle is timeless. It's like the laws of physics. They don't change, but technology always changes. So it's the same. The ritual etiquette that he selects to create this compilation, the Essentials of Daily Etiquette, are actually taken from texts that are over 2,000 years old. But you can see that the essence of it is actually still applicable. And that's really amazing. But it doesn't amaze us at all, in fact, because at the end of the day, Confucius is talking about our humanity. And this humanity is timeless. It's a constancy, regardless of when we're talking about from the times of Confucius or now. So in order to tap into this humanity, in order to realize it, then there are going to be certain principles that don't change. And so, yes, we use different ways of communicating, but everyone still knows not to interrupt when someone else is talking. That was the case in the times of Confucius, and it's the case now, because we all want to show respect and give respect to others, and also be respected. That doesn't change as well. So I hope I've answered that question. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. I'm conscious of the time. We've come to the break time now. So we're going to take a break for 10 minutes and we'll come back in 10 minutes time. So enjoy your break and we'll see you very soon. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And very warm welcome back to the final part of our first session. And I now have the honour of taking you through Confucian thought on friendship. Now, before I begin, I wanted to say very grateful to the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, to the Academy of Sinology for giving me this opportunity to participate in the inaugural series, Sinology Art of Living Seminars. My heartfelt thanks also to my family, my teachers, my friends, and scholars past and present. As Catherine mentioned before, it really does feel like we're standing on the shoulders of giants when we're reading from these time-honoured Chinese texts. The topic of this talk is You've Got a Friend in Me, on friendship. The other day, I found in my neighbour's living room a plaque, and the plaque read, "Friends are the sunshine of life." I thought that in one short sentence captured very beautifully how our friends provide essential warmth and light to our lives, the warmth of kindness and compassion, and the light of wisdom and humour. When we think of our times with friends, I'm sure you'll think of the great times, laughter, shared joy. It's been said that friends are the family we get to choose for ourselves. And the Australian-based sinologist Ping Wang, on writing about the Chinese concept of friendship from a Confucian perspective, observed this. Friendship is part of the narrative and morality particular of Chinese people, which has been shaped and enriched by the intellectual tradition. In fact, the word for friend appears to be the earliest, one of the oldest texts, called the Classical Changes, or you might know it as the I Ching, and I've underlined the character for friend in red. Now, for this talk, I'm going to be looking at 3 questions. What really makes a friendship? What should we look for in a friend? And how can we be a good friend from the Confucian perspective? I would suggest that these questions are as interesting to us today as they were for Confucius and his students over 2,000 years ago. And understanding a bit more about these questions provides fresh insights and ideas for our building rewarding and lasting friendships. So in Confucian philosophy, friendship is a very important category of interpersonal relationships. Now, if you think about it, everyone, regardless of where we're born, who we are, well, everyone is bound to have some friends because no person is really an island. Confucian thought categorizes our interpersonal relationships into 5 main categories or types, as you might have remember, Catherine, before. 3 types within the family, and they're the relationship between spouses, the relationship between parent and child, and the relationship between siblings. Now, beyond the family, you have the relationship between leader and subordinate, or leader and team member, as we do in the workplace between employer and employee, and also the relationship among friends. Now, from the Confucian perspective, there's a bit of a hierarchy built into the roles of leader and subordinate, but friendship is among equals. So friends aren't necessarily defined by family or work, but you obviously need to be associated with a friend in some way. Is it just about attending the same school or working at the same place? Well, it's obviously a little bit more than that, because, and also it's more than sharing the same interests, because, for example, not everyone who enjoys tennis are called friends. So the first question is, what makes a friendship from the Confucian perspective of the Confucian tradition? Well, if we look at that, we know that friends are important for our happiness and emotional well-being. But Confucius also tells us that friends can help us realize our innate goodness. There's a depth to this relationship. It's more than what we can see here. There's a depth. And in the Confucian context, friendship is no ordinary acquaintance, because there's some aspect of the relationship where you help each other practice virtue and develop moral excellence. These sorts of friends trust each other enough to value honest feedback and advice. Now, if we look at the Chinese character for friend, this is how it's written today on the left. On the right is a page from a Chinese dictionary, the first Chinese dictionary to arrange the characters in order of the character components. And the dictionary is called the Shuwen Jiezi, which roughly translates to explaining graphs and analysing characters. Now, this dictionary definition for the character for friend tells us 2 things. First, it tells us that a friend is someone who shares the same aspirations. And the second thing it tells us is that, well, this character is written the way that it is because it's meant to depict 2 hands. Now, this might be more directly appreciated when we look at the earlier form here that I've encircled, what's known as the seal script. And you see the 2 hands. The 2 hands sort of facing the same direction as well, which sort of brings to mind, our allies, pulling on the same side in a tug of war, perhaps. Now, this was the definition for this Chinese character for friend that was derived from this dictionary compiled in the 2nd century by the Han Dynasty philologist Chen. Now, this character has also been interpreted in the 18th century by the Qing Dynasty scholar Duan Yucai. And he interpreted this character, with these 2 hands, as representing 2 people. 2 people working together, supporting each other, just like our left and right hands. It's as if one cannot do without the other. So the Chinese character friend alerts us to the idea that at the heart of the relationship between friends is a shared commitment to moral excellence and support for each other to achieve moral excellence. In the Confucian context, friend is someone who can actively contribute to a person's ethical cultivation. It's a hands-on endeavor, if you like. In the words of the early 20th century Singaporean scholar, Lin Boon Keng, or Lin Wenqing, he emphasizes that the Confucian view of friendship is that friends are not only to be regarded as a source of pleasure, but also to be remembered as the moral lever whereby the good of our fellow human beings is to be promoted. So there's a shared commitment to ethical cultivation among friends. And part and parcel of that is a mutual appreciation for moral progress and moral achievement. Now, just to give us a bit of a flavour of this idea of Confucian friendship, I'd like to share with you a well-known story of the scholar official Su Shi. Su Shi lived in the 11th century, time known as the Song dynasty in China. Given the government sponsorship of Buddhist learning at the time, Confucian scholars like Su Shi would associate with Buddhist masters and also learn from the Buddhist teachings. Now, Su Shi prided himself on his broad learning, and he was close friends with the Buddhist master by the name of Fo Ying. Now, one time, Su Shi felt particularly proud of his progress in personal cultivation, and he put pen to paper. He wrote a poem, and in this poem, he expressed that he had attained the level of being unmoved by the 8 winds. You're probably wondering, what are the 8 winds? Well, the 8 winds is actually a Buddhist term, and it refers to the 8 conditions that prevent someone from progressing along the path to enlightenment. The 8 winds refer to these 8 conditions. They're prosperity, decline, honour, disgrace, praise, censure, pleasure, and suffering. And you'll notice that half of these conditions are actually positive. And that's because people are typically inclined towards the pursuit of prosperity, honour, praise, and pleasure. Unfortunately, under such favourable conditions, it's all too easy to become complacent and then veer into excess, which prevents us from progressing along the moral path. Now, at the same time, people can get caught up with in their aversion to decline, disgrace, censure, and suffering. So Su Shi wrote a poem expressing that he was able to remain unmoved in face of these 8 winds. And he sent his poem along to his good friend, Master Fo Ying. Master Fo Ying took one look at the poem and he wrote just one word back and sent his reply right back. Now, on receiving the master's reply, Su Shi was so incensed by the seemingly offensive remark that he set off right away to see the master. When he arrived, Master Fo Ying happened to be away in another town, but he left a note at the gate for Su Shi. And the note read, "Unmoved by the 8 winds, affected by a small fart." So obviously, Su Shi and Master Fo Ying were such close friends that the master could anticipate Su Shi's reaction. He could predict that Su Shi would be so upset that he would immediately, set out crossing the river to demand an explanation from the master in person. So all Master Fo Ying needed to do was to remind Su Shi to, stop kidding himself. The relationship between the two was obviously strong enough that the master could, test him, criticize him, and encourage or exhort him to do better. And it illustrates that friendship is a relationship based on mutual trust and support in moral cultivation. Now, it's friends like Master Fo Ying that can help keep us grounded. They can burst our bubbles of conceit and complacency. We know that friends are there to lend an ear or lend a hand in our hour of need. They tell us what we need to know. They're not just there to flatter us or to make us feel good about ourselves all the time, they're there to keep our thoughts on track. Our friends are there to remind us of what's really important in life, where we need to improve, when we've made a mistake, and how we can bring out our full potential. So it suggests that friends like these are really worth their weight in gold, because they can really help us improve and perfect ourselves on a day-to-day basis. Well, in the Analects, we see Master Zeng, and he's one of Confucius's foremost, most prominent students. And he had this to say about friendship. Master Zeng said, "Through culture, the exemplary person makes friends, and through friends, they develop their humanity." Now, the key word here is the word culture. And given the sort of historical context, what Master Zeng is referring to is improving oneself through cultural refinement, the learning of the manners, rituals, like the ritual etiquette that we heard before, the practices, principles, and standards that we find in the earliest classical Chinese texts that were traditionally attributed to the most enlightened thinkers, and they were called sages. So in today's world, this would be coming together as equals to share and learn from one another our ideas on the cultivation of ethical character. And as you can imagine, this scope is actually quite broad. It could mean a conference, or simply just having a cup of tea together. Our views on learning and practice for character cultivation. Now, this coming together is essentially a meeting of minds. And as we said before, friends should share the same aspirations. And we see this inherently in the Chinese words used to describe good friends. For example, 志同道合, meaning someone who shares the same goals and aspirations and taking the same approach. 知己, someone who understands me like a bosom friend. Or 知音, meaning someone who understands, knows my tune. So it's not about what our friends wear, where they live, their career or financial status. True friends are certainly linked, as expressed in these quotes here. And in the Confucian context, the link is characterized by shared aspirations of cultural refinement for ethical character. So you can have two or more people being committed to helping one another to do better as human beings. And how do they do that? Well, they do so by perfecting their knowledge and by setting a good example in moral learning and practice. And if you think about it, people often find it far easier to notice the faults of others compared to themselves. So it's often through our friends, through their words and conduct, that we discover our own strengths and shortcomings. Now, even when some people realize their shortcomings, their faults, they can sometimes find it difficult to get themselves to change, as Confucius observed here. In the Analects, Confucius said, I've yet to see anyone who can recognize his own faults and, look inside of himself and actually blame themselves as opposed to everyone else. So now, yes, it can be hard to correct our faults, and that's where our friends come in. Now, if we go back to the passage before, Master Zeng said, through culture, the exemplary person makes. Notice that this is about the exemplary person. It's someone who is after moral excellence. They're not there to win friends and influence people to try to get ahead or improve sales. They're someone who is actively cultivating their ethical character. And we find that these sentiments are actually echoed in the Mencius, the text called Mencius. Now here we have on the left a depiction, illustration of what the historical Mencius might look like. And the text is a record, I suppose, of Mencius's words, conversations. And if you don't already know, Mencius is the Chinese philosopher who was born about 100 years after Confucius in the 4th century before the Common Era. And he's recognized as the second sage in the Confucian tradition, second only to Confucius himself. So in the Mencius, the text, it records that Mencius said, "Between one another, friends do not presume upon the advantage of being the elder or of high rank or of having family connections. To befriend someone is to befriend their virtue." So Mencius makes it clear that you shouldn't rely on the advantage of being an elder or high rank, senior, idea of relying on the advantage of age, power, or prestige. Those sorts of friendships or those sorts of friends, they tend to be self-interested or self-serving. They're after profit, power, and prestige. Virtuous friends, on the other hand, they'll have your interests at heart. They'll sincerely try to help you improve yourself and progress along the path of moral cultivation. And that's why Confucius was adamant that we associate with those who will help us develop and achieve, develop our virtue and achieve virtues like humanity. Now we can see in the next passage when Confucius was asked by his student, Zigong here, about how to achieve humanity. Confucius said, "A craftsman who wishes to do good work must first sharpen their tools. In whatever country you might settle in, offer your services to the most virtuous ministers and befriend scholars who cultivate humanity." Now, there's a lot in this passage, and we'll take it bit by bit. Confucius really understands his students, and Zigong is someone who can easily become complacent. So Confucius sort of starts with an analogy involving a craftsman having to transform some raw material into something that is more valuable, useful. And this analogy involving craftsman obviously implies effort and work. Now, this analogy with shaping the raw material, the craftsman has to use tools often made of different materials. You can sort of see here whether he's working on wood or stone, etc. And this is, I suppose, analogous to a person who has to rely on their friends to refine their ethical character and to develop their virtues like humanity. Like the raw jade inside the stone that has to be cut and carved and polished, we have to work on ourselves to develop and bring out the virtue that's inside each of us. So we have to make the most of our conditions. And that's everything around us. Our conditions includes the people around us and even the time that we have on this earth. So we make the most of our resources, our conditions, to in whatever we do, to try to improve our ethical character and realize moral excellence. Now, Confucius then draws our attention to two aspects of our condition. First is to do with our work. He does so when he says, whatever country you may settle in, serve the most virtuous ministers. And as we know, work is a very fundamental part of our lives. We want to ensure that the people we work for, people we work with, share the same aspirations. And so Confucius directs us to serve the most virtuous ministers. In those times, they would have been the ones who really had the interests of the state, the interests of the people at heart. Now, then outside of our work, we have our friends, and we should be friends with those who are working on their moral excellence. Befriend scholars who cultivate humanity. You're probably wondering, well, how do I go about identifying those friends? Now, what sort of characteristics might they have? Well, before we explore those very important questions, I'd like to draw together the core elements of what defines friendship in the Confucian tradition. So what makes a friendship? Well, we appreciate our friends for being with us through thick and thin. They listen and they care about us. But perhaps the most important characteristic from a Confucian perspective is that our friends will share our aspirations towards moral excellence, and they'll support us. They're willing and able to support us to develop our ethical character. And develop our ethical character through cultural refinement, as we discussed before. Learning and practicing of the manners, the rituals, the principles, practices, standards of appropriate patterns of conduct. Now, so that's what makes a friendship from the Confucian perspective. Well, what should we look for then in a friend? Well, in the Analects, Confucius tells us that there are 3 types of friends that are helpful and 3 types of friends that are harmful. Friendship with a straightforward, understanding, and the well-informed is helpful. Friendship with the hypocritical, the sycophantic, and the glib-talking is harmful. Now, a contemporary Confucian scholar, Li Pingnan, tells us that we don't need to look for talented all-rounders. As long as a person has one or more of these 3 traits, or straightforward, or understanding, and or well-informed, well, they're a friend to have. We can't expect anyone to be perfect. So, but what do we mean by straightforward, understanding, and well-informed? Let's take a look. Well, straightforward friends, they're open and honest. They can be candid. They're people who say what they mean and then mean what they say. They certainly wouldn't take advantage of us. And they have this upright, sincere attitude. That's a straightforward friend. And then we have the understanding friends. They're very forgiving. They don't hold grudges. They're very considerate. And it's important because these are qualities that we would want to develop in ourselves. So having them around provides us with these positive role models to emulate. So that's the understanding friends. And then last but not least is well-informed friends. Now, these are people who have broad learning, they're very knowledgeable, but they're not obsessive or fixated. Learning from these well-informed friends broadens our outlook and understanding of the world around us. So the helpful friends are straightforward, understanding, and or well-informed. And just to give an example of one of these helpful friends, I'll share with you another anecdote, also from the Song Dynasty. And it's about a high official by the surname of Su. We'll call them Officer Su, and his good friend Ying Twin. Now, Officer Su, he submitted a memorial to the throne, and a memorial is a sort of formal written piece of advice. It set out his recommendations on various state matters. Unfortunately, his recommendations were all ignored. And not only were they ignored, well, the ruler sort of took offense, and Officer Su was demoted and relegated to a role in the provinces, far from the capital as a penalty. Well, on his way to his new job, he stopped by the home of his good friend, Ying Twin, and he sort of complained to his friend that, unfairly treated because, he served the court with nothing but the utmost sincerity and loyalty, and, this is his outcome. Now, on hearing this, his friend, Ying Twin, sort of asks him 2 questions. He said, well, at the time when you submitted this memorial, were you acting in the interests of the people? Or were you more, interested in your own career advancement? if you were acting in the interests of the people, then you should cheerfully head on to this new job. But if you were more interested in your own career advancement, your career prospects, then this demotion would count as like punishment. Now these words got through to Officer Saul. He stopped feeling sorry for himself. He stopped feeling, harboring resentment against the court. And I would say that Intwin is someone who is straightforward, well-informed enough to help keep his friend, Officer Saul, their thoughts on track. So that's one example of a helpful friend. And besides the helpful friends, there are also 3 types of harmful ones, and I've sort of highlighted them in red. It's a bit of a caution. You have the hypocritical friends. They say one thing, do another. They're misleading and deceptive, and they pretend to be better than they really are. And they might even get away with it because, they're good at flattery, very smooth talkers. Then there are the sycophantic friends. They're the charmers. They make us feel that we are excellent when we're not. And the trouble is that, some people might actually believe them and then lack any motivation to try to improve themselves because they think they're already good enough, right? Or they could become, arrogant. And as they say, pride comes before the fall. So that's the sycophantic friends. And then there are the glib-talking friends. And these are people who are, they speak so confidently, so good with their words, that they can win any argument, no matter how unreasonable. And you could probably pick up a bit of a trend here. The common denominator, you could say, among these sorts of friends is that they're very persuasive speakers. And it's easy to be around people who seem to know the right things to say. But at the end of the day, whether they're harmful or helpful, lies in the intentions, their motives behind their words, what they say. Are their intentions selfless or selfish? Now, the attitude towards dishonest words, I think about the passage from Master Xun or Xunzi, and Xunzi, he lived after Mencius, and he was the leading Confucian scholar of his day. He held a high office at one point, and it's through his writing, his teachings, that he hoped to benefit society. And many of his students certainly went on to government careers and to serve at court. Well, Xunzi, in the text called Master Xun, records that he wrote, or he said, that someone who correctly criticizes me is my teacher, and someone you can really learn from. Someone who correctly praises me is my friend, but someone who flatters me is my enemy or my foe. So that sort of highlights the danger of these dishonest words, whether they're from hypocritical, sycophantic, or glib-talking friends. And just to clarify that, a teacher can also be a friend. There's someone you look up to, learn from. So that's from Xunzi. Now, another thing to bear in mind is that we tend to spend a lot of time with our friends. And as a result, we tend to pick up their habits, for better or worse. And this can happen subconsciously. Now, the company of good friends and helpful friends has been likened to a room of fresh flowers, diffusing their fragrance. And these flowers, the fragrance envelopes everything in an atmosphere of delightful perfume. Now, in contrast, the society of harmful friends is like entering a fish shop. The unpleasant odor of the fish is at first almost insufferable. But, in the course of time, the smell ceases to be disagreeable. And why that is because, our sense of smell, the olfactory sense, becomes paralyzed so that we stop picking up the offensive smells, so that those who remain in that fish shop may no longer be conscious of anything smelling offensive at all. And so similarly, the corrupting influence of harmful friends, their negative examples, can blunt our moral sense and make us condone that which we would otherwise condemn. So it sort of tells us to take care in the company that we keep. If you think about it, to be able to identify and associate with the helpful friends, we really have to be the friend that we would wish for. And in trying to be this ideal friend, it sort of brings to mind this piece of advice from Confucius in the Analects. Confucius said, hold faithfulness and sincerity as first principles. Don't have friends that differ from yourself, and don't be afraid to correct your faults. Now, faithfulness and sincerity, these traits relate to being conscientious in our learning and practice for, ethical character. Now, it can probably sound a bit abstract. So if I use an example, people tend to find it easier to think about their physical self as opposed to their moral self. So in physical terms, sincerity might be, do I really want to be fit and healthy, keep healthy, make healthy choices? And then faithfulness would be, well, do I keep at it and see things through to the finish? So that's an analogy, and we can certainly apply those principles to our moral self cultivation. For example, we might choose to learn and practice even when others, the people around us, do not. And interestingly, we'll find that the more that we learn and practice, the more we develop our moral qualities, the more faith we have in the texts, and the more confidence we have in ourselves and our innate potential for moral greatness. So I'm sure you'll all agree that at the start of our ethical cultivation, choose a conducive environment. You want to be around people, friends, who will encourage you to develop your ethical character. It's a bit like being in this class. You can see in the picture, the teacher might be far away, right at the front of the class, but it's a good thing to have the people around you. We'll call them, your exercise friends. Based on their posture, you can correct yourself. The helpful friends literally show us how we might want to improve. When we happen to see a friend make a mistake, well, we can reflect on ourselves and take extra care not to make the same mistake. And obviously, being their friend, we can help them realize that, they've made a mistake. But I'll go into that a little bit later. Now, so it's important to have friends, people around you with the same aspirations, or at least they'll encourage you to progress on the path of ethical cultivation. Now, Mencius points out that aside from people, our contemporaries, we can look to friends in the past, in terms of the positive and negative exemplars that we find in the time-honoured texts, whether that be the classics, the historical writings, the masters or the philosophical writings, or the literary works. Mencius here is talking to a student, and he's saying, the good scholar, someone who is learning and actively cultivating their ethical character. Well, they're going to be friends with other good scholars in the village, in the state, abroad, but they could also go back to learn from those in the past. And actually, Mencius recommends that such friends are the best. So we don't need to feel limited to the people that we know or meet today. For example, when we read the Analects, we can reflect on the Confucius that emerges from the page. Would I be able to say what Confucius said? Do I really believe that he's right? If not, what's stopping me? How can I change? Now, the other idea that can be misinterpreted here is not having friends that differ from oneself. Does that mean that we start excluding people or stick to a small clique? Well, let's see what Confucius' students have to say. In this passage, there they were both students of Confucius, but they in turn, in time, had students of their own. And we see that here, the students of Zixia, they ask of Zizhang about, who to associate with, who should we be friends with? Zizhang replies, well, what does your teacher, Zixia, what did he say? And they replied, well, Zixia said, associate with the right sort of people. Avoid people who are not of the right sort. Well, Zizhang has a different idea. And he says, an exemplary person exalts those of virtue and is tolerant of everyone. He praises those who are truly efficacious and is sympathetic with those who are less so. If I have great virtue, of whom should I not be tolerant of? If I don't have great virtue, people will avoid me. How would I be able to avoid them? So we can see that both Zixia and Zizhang, they both refer to friends, of a moral dimension to our friends. But how do we reconcile these two perspectives? They're a little bit different. You could say that Zixia is talking about first principles, advising his students to make sure they take care in the company that they keep. They want to be associating, befriending those of good moral character, the virtuous friends. Now, Zizhang, on the other hand, he's trying to develop their judgment a little bit, and he's talking about relating with others generally. Now, most commentaries, they support the idea that whether one should follow or avoid a friend goes in our minds. We ask ourselves, would it be right for me to follow what the other person is doing? When we decide that question, we'll know, whether we want to exalt or tolerate or praise or sympathize. And regardless of what we decide, we should show respect for others. So as to what to look for in a friend, we know that we want friends who are helpful to our cultivation of ethical character. And they'll be straightforward, understanding, and or well-informed. We want to look for positive role models. They'll share our aspirations towards excellence. We want to look for those who are sincere and faithful in their learning and practice with ethical character. And of course, we'll be discerning in our choices of what behaviours we want to follow. But we should always maintain a respectfulness for everyone. So that's about what to look for in a friend. Now, how can we be a good friend? Well, in the Analects, Confucius is asked by his student about what it takes to be a scholar. And the scholar in this context is someone who is learning, for sure, but who's also actively cultivating their ethical character. So that's why it's relevant. And Mencius sort of says, well, being earnest, exacting, and amicable, you could be a scholar. Earnest and exacting with friends, amicable with siblings. So notice that there are 3 key words: earnest, exacting, and amicable. And there's a distinction drawn between siblings and friends. With siblings, we are to be amicable. Can't be too harsh or severe because we want to maintain the harmony within our family, prevent discord. Whereas with friends, we can be perhaps a bit more direct, earnest and exacting with our friends. But obviously we need to strike a balance. We don't want to go too far. So in another passage where Confucius is asked by another student about friendship, he replies, give them loyal advice, guide them tactfully, and if that fails, desist. Don't humiliate yourself or expose yourself to rebuff. And this relates to being honest with our friends. Obviously, to give them advice, to give them guidance, we have to build up a certain amount of trust in that relationship. But friends ultimately have this moral duty to guide and encourage each other towards ethical conduct. And at the same time, there's a moral duty to help prevent and correct misconduct. At the end of the day, it's not enough just to have good advice. We also have to know how and when to give that advice. We have to know how much our friend can take. and when might be the best time to proffer our counsel. It's also about striking a balance. With some friends, we have to know to stop. If what we say fails, we have to stop. Don't strain the friendship. Of course, with some friends, we just know that they won't listen. So we can think about using our actions to show them what we mean to say. For example, one time the ruler of the state of Wei, he wanted to ask Confucius about military tactics, or Confucius to give him advice in terms of military strategies and tactics. And Confucius pretends not to know, and he votes with his feet by leaving that state the following day. And he didn't want any part of the state going to war. So is that being honest? Well, being honest is honesty for our friends' sake. Now, on the idea of respectfulness, I think it's also important to look at this passage where Confucius once praised his contemporary, Master Yan Pingzhong. And Master Yan was an accomplished statesman, philosopher, and his words were recorded, transmitted, and even translated, as we can see here. Confucius said, Yan Pingzhong was skilled in interacting with others. Even toward those he had known for a long time, he remained respectful. And there are two interpretations of this last phrase. He remained respectful. One interpretation is that Master Yan remained respectful to his friends, or others, his friends still continued to respect him after having known him for a long while. Now, some people who've known their friends for a long time, they go back a long way. Sometimes they've grown apart. They may have had different views or disagreements. And over time, people may become overly familiar and forget their initial good manners sometimes. It can be difficult to remain respectful, as if you'd just met them after you've known them for a long time. Master Yan was able to do so, and as a result, his friends afforded him the same respect. So in answer to the question of how can we be a good friend, well, from the Confucian perspective, a good friend is someone who is willing and able to help us develop our ethical character and work towards moral excellence. Someone who will be there for us in all the steps in between, like the picture here. They'll listen to us, give us advice, guidance, and they will always try to love and respect us. Now, in friendship, we receive profound joy and, from communicating with those who truly understand and appreciate us. And the hands here, sort of in these photos, sort of remind me of the character for friend with the two hands. It's a very hands-on endeavour. But not only that, friendship gives us vital support to develop our ethical character and realise the full potential of innate goodness. Now, I hope that these perspectives on what makes a friendship, what to look for in a friend, and how we can be a good friend can contribute to our building rewarding and lasting relationships. Wish you all good health, great friends, and happiness always. Thank you very much for your attention. Now, I'm conscious of the time. Let me just exit the full screen. I can see the chat box. If you have a question, please feel free to type into the chat, or you can pipe up. Let me just stop sharing. Okay. Raise your hand and you can ask directly. But if there aren't any questions, I think that with the time being what it is, I'll bring this session to a close. So I want to thank you all for joining us. This concludes the first session of the Academy's Sinology Art of Living seminars. But wait, there is more. This isn't the end. Our next session begins at 1 p.m. UK time, or if you're going by Beijing time, that's 8 p.m. I'm looking forward to it very much. and I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.